The pre-dawn stillness of Oak Haven, usually a time of hushed anticipation for the coming day, was savagely, irrevocably shattered. A sudden, violent percussion, a brutal guttural cough of displaced earth, shattered stone and splintered wood, ripped through the quiet tree-lined suburban street. The explosion sent violent, sickening tremors, shuddering through the foundations of Amelia Rodriguez's small cottage, rattling windows in their frames, dislodging a cherished photograph of her late brother David in his Marine Corps dress blues from the mantelpiece. Birdsong, just moments before a cheerful melodic herald of the approaching sunrise, ceased with an almost audible collective gasp, abruptly replaced by the high-pitched, insistent, painful ringing in Amelia's ears. The acrid, metallic tang of gunpowder, sharp and alien, stung her nostrils, clawing at the back of her throat, a taste of violence she had only ever read about. Her breath hitched a strangled, disbelieving gasp, escaping her lips as she stared eyes wide with a dawning, visceral horror through her bedroom window. Across the street, where just hours before, vibrant, meticulously tended rows of deep purple lavender and silver-gray rosemary had bloomed in defiant, fragrant testament to lives lost and battles bravely fought, there was now a gaping, smoking crater. This garden, their garden, the veterans' serenity garden, a sanctuary nurtured by the calloused, patient hands of men and women who had borne the visible and invisible scars of service, many of whom were her dear friends, was now a scene of utter, heartbreaking devastation. The air, usually sweet with the scent of blossoms, damp earth, and the faint, comforting aroma of Gunny Miller's pipe tobacco, was now thick, almost unbreathable, with the smell of smoke cordite, and something else, something chemical, and deeply primordially unsettling. Amelia stumbled forward, her thin cotton dressing gown offering little protection against the sudden unnatural chill of the morning air. Her gardening gloves, which she'd left on the porch table after a late evening, tending her own small patch of memorial lilies for David, were miraculously still there, and she pulled them on by instinct, her hands trembling so violently she could barely grasp them. They were already coated in a fine, gritty layer of gray dust and debris that seemed to settle everywhere, a macabre, ghostly shroud. Tears, hot and stinging, welled in her eyes, blurring the sharp, cruel edges of the destruction, transforming the scene into a wavering, nightmarish, almost hallucinatory tableau. Through the haze of her tears and the lingering smoke, she recognized the mangled, twisted remains of the handcrafted wooden sign. Its carefully painted, hopeful letters, painstakingly rendered by Sarah Jenkins' artistic daughter, spelling out Veterans Serenity Garden, were now splintered, charred, and almost unrecognizable. This wasn't just a collection of plants and soil. It was a sanctuary, a hallowed place of healing, a living, breathing memorial, painstakingly etched into the very heart of their close-knit, usually peaceful community. And someone with deliberate, unimaginable, almost inhuman malice had sought to obliterate it, to silence its quiet, persistent message of remembrance, resilience, and peace. The force of the blast had even dislodged several of the small hand-painted memorial stones, each one representing a life, a story, a sacrifice. They were scattered like discarded, meaningless refuse. One she noticed with a fresh, piercing stab of pain that took her breath away, bearing the name Sergeant. Michael Evans, always remembered, lay cracked in two beside a shattered antique bird bath that Mrs. Henderson Michael's grieving mother had lovingly polished every week. Another for CPL Maria Sanchez, our hero, was half buried in the upturned earth, its inscription obscured by mud and debris. Her brother David's stone, a simple granite paver she had placed herself, was mercifully still visible, though covered in soot. The sight of it, so vulnerable, so desecrated, felt like a physical blow to her own heart. Later that day, the hushed, anxious murmur of concerned neighbors and somber-faced, deeply shaken veterans filled Amelia's small, usually sunlit kitchen. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee, normally a comforting, welcoming scent in her home, did little to dispel the oppressive, almost tangible cloud of shock grief and a simmering, helpless anger that hung heavy in the air. Sarah Jenkins. Amelia's closest neighbor, a kind, gentle soul whose own father had served 2 tours in Vietnam and rarely spoke of it, wrung her hands ceaselessly, her usually cheerful, rosy face pale and drawn with an almost unbearable shock. "I just don't understand it, Amelia," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears and raw, bewildered disbelief. Who could possibly do such a terrible, hateful, evil thing? What kind of person, what kind of monster, targets something so sacred, so peaceful? Across the small, worn Formica table, David "Gunny" Miller, a retired Marine gunnery sergeant, whose imposing physical presence was matched only by his usually gentle heart, and who dedicated his early mornings to tending the garden's struggling but beloved rose bushes, with a fierce protective tenderness that mirrored his service, sat with a grim, unyielding, almost terrifying set to his jaw. His usually jovial, crinkly-eyed demeanor was completely extinguished, replaced by a cold, hard, dangerous anger that seemed to radiate from him in waves. His large, calloused hands that had known both the tools of war and the delicate stems of roses were clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists on the tabletop. It was deliberate, he stated flatly, his voice raspy, each word a chip of ice, cutting through Sarah's sorrowful whispers. No damn gas leak, no accidental fire from some careless cigarette. This was planned, calculated. Someone wanted this garden gone. Amelia, and they wanted to send a message. A loud, damn ugly message. He looked around the small, crowded group, his eyes usually crinkling with good humor and kindness, now narrowed steely and filled with a pain that was almost too much to bear. And they used explosives. That takes planning. That takes access. That takes intent. Cold-blooded intent. Amelia listened, her heart a cold, heavy, aching knot in her chest. She had helped Gunny plant those very roses, each thorny stem, each fragile, fragrant bloom, a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity. She had sat with Sarah on countless warm, sun-drenched afternoons, their hands deep in the rich, dark soil, pulling weeds, sharing quiet stories, and listening to the veterans who found a rare and precious solace, a moment of peace among the fragrant blooms and the gentle, reassuring hum of bees. This attack felt intensely, deeply personal, a brutal violation of their shared, sacred space, a calculated, vicious desecration of ground, made holy by memory, by sacrifice, by love. As the initial numbing shock began to wear off, replaced by a confusing, disorienting fog of grief and disbelief, and the days turned into a bewildering, surreal blur of police interviews, forensic teams in white Tyvek suits, meticulously combing through the wreckage, and tense, bewildered, often tearful community meetings, a single name began to surface. It was whispered at first, with a mixture of disbelief, reluctance, and a kind of communal shame. How could one of their own be capable of such a thing? Then, with growing certainty, with mounting evidence, and finally, with a righteous, unifying anger, the name was spoken aloud: Karen Henderson. Karen Henderson, a relatively recent and conspicuously unwelcome newcomer to their otherwise peaceful, established, and close-knit Oak Haven neighborhood, had made her presence and her displeasure known almost immediately through a series of increasingly audacious, abrasive, and often public complaints about the veterans' Serenity Garden. From the moment she'd moved into the pristine, sterile modern house, directly opposite the small plot of public land, a house that seemed to sneer at the more modest older homes around it, she had voiced her objections. She had publicly and loudly at several neighborhood association meetings, and even in letters to the local paper, deemed the garden unsightly, its naturally unmanicured cottage-style edges, its lovingly tended but imperfect rows, and the eclectic, heartfelt, and deeply personal collection of memorial stones, small flags, and wind chimes clashing violently, in her opinion, with her own meticulously curated, unnervingly perfect, almost artificial lawn and minimalist, severe landscaping. It was, she declared, an embarrassment to the neighborhood. She had engaged in several heated public arguments with the veterans, including a particularly nasty one with Gunny Miller about what she termed the disorderly and disrespectful placement of American flags, far too many in her view, and not flown according to her interpretation of flag code. She had also complained bitterly about the unnecessary noise of their early morning gatherings, the quiet camaraderie, the shared coffee and donuts, the low murmur of voices sharing memories and offering mutual support, which she perceived as a personal affront to her peace, her sleep, and her property values. She had even, Amelia recalled now, with a sickening shiver of revulsion, made a coldly dismissive comment about the garden lowering property values for those of us who have made a real investment in this community, a remark that had stung the veterans, many of whom were on fixed incomes, deeply and personally. She had also, on one occasion, been overheard by Sarah Jenkins muttering about the veterans being a bunch of damaged freeloaders looking for sympathy. That. Her complaints, initially dismissed by most in the neighborhood as the eccentricities and teething troubles of a new, overly particular, perhaps unhappy resident struggling to adjust to a community with different values, now took on a deeply sinister and profoundly disturbing light in the aftermath of the bombing. The hardware store footage was the turning point. The true inciting incident, the moment vague, uneasy suspicion, began to solidify into horrifying, almost unbearable certainty arrived in the form of grainy, time-stamped security camera footage. Detective Ramirez, a young, sharp and tenacious investigator with the Havenwood PD, a man who had grown up in Oak Haven and knew many of the veterans personally, had painstakingly obtained it from a large hardware superstore located 2 towns over. The footage, though not crystal clear, the subject partially obscured by a baseball cap and large sunglasses, showed a woman her expensive-looking blonde hair, her designer handbag, her distinctive athletic shoes, and her general build, strikingly, undeniably resembling Karen Henderson's. She was purchasing a significant, unusual quantity of commercial-grade fireworks, the powerful explosive kind often used in professional displays, not the backyard variety. And more chillingly, several packs of readily available, though theoretically regulated and traceable electronic detonators, and wiring just 3 days before the explosion. The police, now armed with this damning visual evidence, the consistent testimonies of Karen's persistent, escalating, and vocal animosity towards the garden and its stewards, and a preliminary forensics report from the blast site, indicating the explosive used was consistent with a large quantity of high-powered pyrotechnics, paid Karen Henderson a formal visit. Karen, initially indignant, projecting an air of offended, almost theatrical innocence, and immediately threatening to call her high-powered lawyer, became visibly flustered, defensive, and ultimately almost comically unraveled when confronted with the stills from the security footage. While she didn't outright confess, her increasingly evasive, contradictory answers, her trembling hands that she tried to hide behind her back, her darting guilty eyes, and her lawyer's immediate, almost preemptive arrival on her doorstep, he must have been on speed dial. Spoke volumes, painting a clear, undeniable picture of guilt rather than genuine outrage. "This is harassment." She'd blustered, her voice unnaturally high-pitched, but her eyes, those cold, calculating blue eyes, darted nervously around the room, betraying her carefully constructed facade of suburban respectability. "I was planning a private party," she'd stammered unconvincingly. "A very large party." The rising action of the community's response began not with a bang, but with a quiet, simmering collective fury that spread through Oak Haven like wildfire, igniting a sense of purpose and unity that many had thought long dormant. The veterans, initially heartbroken adrift in a sea of profound grief, disbelief, and a deeply personal sense of violation, found their sorrow slowly, inexorably turning into a steely, unyielding, righteous resolve. Gunny Miller, his eyes blazing with a familiar, disciplined, almost terrifying fire, Amelia hadn't seen since she'd once glimpsed an old, faded photograph of him in his Marine Corps dress uniform from his combat days, rallied his comrades, and indeed the entire neighborhood, with a quiet, resonant intensity that was far more powerful, far more motivating than any shouted words or angry rhetoric. "They may have blown up our soil, our plants, our stones," he declared at a hastily organized, overflowing community meeting held in the somewhat stuffy but welcoming familiar local church hall. His voice, though strained with emotion and lack of sleep, ringing with unwavering conviction and a deep, resonant authority that commanded respect. "They may have desecrated our sacred ground, but they can't blow up our memories. They can't blow up our brotherhood, our sisterhood. They cannot, and they will not, extinguish the spirit of this place, the spirit of those we honor here." His words were met not with loud applause, but with a quiet, determined "Ura" from some of the younger veterans in the room, solemn, tearful nods from the older ones, and a palpable wave of shared determination from the assembled neighbors. The community shocked out of its usual suburban complacency, and routines rallied around the veterans with a passion, a generosity, and a unity that surprised even Amelia, who had lived in Oak Haven her entire life. Donations small and large, tangible and intangible, poured in. Crumpled $5 bills from pensioners on fixed incomes, generous checks from local businesses who had previously shown little interest in community affairs, pledges of materials and labor, from construction companies and landscaping firms. Neighbors who had previously only exchanged polite, distant nods now offered their time, their skills, their unwavering support, their casseroles, their shoulders to cry on. Local nurseries, hearing the news, promised replacement plants, shrubs, and even mature trees free of charge. A local stonemason himself, a veteran's son, offered to repair any salvageable memorial plaques and to carve new ones at cost. Amelia usually reserved almost shy content in her quiet routines of library work, and tending her own small patch of memorial lilies for her brother David, found herself unexpectedly reluctantly thrust to the forefront of this burgeoning grassroots movement. She discovered a wellspring of organizational skills she hadn't known she possessed. She began coordinating volunteers with surprising efficiency, meticulously tracking donations in a borrowed school notebook, and navigating the often frustrating labyrinthine bureaucratic hurdles of permits, permissions, and city ordinances with a newfound quiet assertiveness that brooked no argument. The destroyed garden, a symbol of their collective pain and loss, paradoxically became a symbol of their resilience, their unity, their defiance, a rallying cry against intolerance, disrespect, and the insidious creeping rot of selfish individualism that Karen Henderson embodied. Vigils were held nightly at the edge of the cordoned-off blast site, candles flickering in the darkness where flowers once bloomed their fragile, hopeful light, a small but potent defiance against the violence and hatred that had scarred their community. Then came the first shocking, calculated blow from the enemy camp, a legal ambush that left the community reeling confused and deeply disheartened. Karen Henderson, through her slick, expensive-looking, and utterly reptilian lawyer, a man named Arthur Jennings, whose condescending smile seemed permanently cruelly affixed to his face, filed a lawsuit against the town of Oak Haven, and by extension, against the VFW Post and the Garden Committee. The lawsuit, a masterpiece of obfuscation, filled with arcane legal jargon, twisted logic, and baseless inflammatory accusations, claimed the Veterans Serenity Garden was an unauthorized and unpermitted structure erected on designated public land. It further alleged it was a public nuisance that detracted from the neighborhood's aesthetic appeal and ludicrously outrageously posed a significant safety and security hazard to the residents of Willow Creek Preserve. It demanded not only its permanent removal and the restoration of the land to an empty grassed state, but also substantial financial compensation for Karen Henderson for the severe emotional distress loss of enjoyment of her property and significant diminution of property value she had allegedly suffered due to the garden's proximity. The sheer, unmitigated, breathtaking audacity of the claim, coming from the person widely, almost universally suspected of bombing the garden in the first place, sent a fresh wave of outrage, disbelief, and despair through the community. It felt like a second, more insidious assault, a cruel and cynical attempt to not only erase the physical memorial, but also to invalidate their sacrifices, their grief, their memories, and their very right to remember their fallen in a place of their own making. The legal battle that ensued became a bitter, protracted, and emotionally draining affair. Sapping the community's already strained financial resources, donations meant for rebuilding were now diverted to legal fees and testing their collective resolve to its absolute limits. Jennings Karen's lawyer was a master of delay and obfuscation, adept at filing motion after frivolous motion, requesting endless depositions, burying them in paperwork, all designed to wear them down, to bleed them dry, to make them give up. He even tried to subpoena Amelia's personal financial records, claiming she was somehow profiting from the rebuilding donations. The second shocking development, a twist that would ultimately change the entire trajectory of the conflict, flipping the script in a way no one could have anticipated, arrived unexpectedly hidden within dusty, forgotten municipal archives in the basement of the old town hall. During a frustratingly slow, painstaking, and often discouraging title search of the land where the garden stood, a tedious but necessary task Amelia had taken upon herself with the help of a retired, sharp-witted paralegal from the community, Mrs. Gable, she stumbled upon a crucial, overlooked, almost indecipherable addendum to an ancient land grant document. The land, while managed locally by the town parks department for decades and widely assumed to be straightforward public parkland, was actually due to a forgotten covenant from the early 20th century, when the land was gifted to the town by a philanthropic Civil War veteran under the direct jurisdiction and protective oversight of the National Military Memorials Division, a relatively small but powerful federal agency, Amelia, like most, had barely known existed. And even more surprisingly, as Amelia dug deeper cross-referencing federal employee databases with local property records, she discovered that the current secretary of this significant, though often low-profile federal division, was a woman named Eleanor Vance. Amelia racked her brain, a vague image forming. She remembered seeing Eleanor Vance at a few town events over the years, Memorial Day parades, the annual 4th of July picnic. A quiet, unassuming woman with intelligent, observant eyes, always impeccably dressed in understated classic suits, but never drawing attention to herself. She always seemed to listen, more than she spoke, an observer on the periphery, polite but distant. Amelia, like most in Oak Haven, had had no inkling of Eleanor's true, high-ranking position in Washington, D.C., nor her profound, almost invisible, yet deeply significant legal connection to the hallowed ground their town had unknowingly hosted and now seen desecrated. The midpoint twist, the revelation that would irrevocably alter the balance of power that would transform their desperate local struggle into a federal case, came with the quiet, almost accidental and deeply poignant discovery of Eleanor Vance's profoundly personal connection to the Veterans Serenity Garden. While meticulously cross-referencing names from the salvaged, damaged memorial plaques, many of which were now stored carefully in Gunny Miller's garage, with lists of original donors, VFW membership rolls, and local families with known military ties, Amelia found it. It was a small, weathered, almost hidden brass plaque, partially obscured by overgrown ivy at the base of an old oak tree, before the explosion, a tree that was now heavily damaged. The plaque was dedicated simply to Captain Michael Vance, USMC, beloved brother, Semper Fi. A quick, respectful, and somewhat trembling online search confirmed Amelia's burgeoning, almost unbelievable suspicion. Captain Michael Vance, a decorated Marine helicopter pilot who had died tragically in a training accident stateside after completing 2 distinguished, harrowing combat tours in Afghanistan, was Eleanor Vance's younger, much beloved, and only brother. The quiet, seemingly detached, high-ranking federal bureaucrat in Washington, D.C., the woman who held the fate of national memorials in her hands, had a profound, heartbreakingly personal stake in the fate of this small-town memorial garden. The destruction of the garden was not just an abstract act of vandalism against public property, not just an attack on a group of veterans. It was a direct, brutal personal assault on her brother's memory, on her own family's private, enduring grief, and on the sacrifices of countless others whose names were etched onto those stones, whose stories were woven into the fabric of that sacred place. The fight for Eleanor Vance had just become intensely, irrevocably personal, and Eleanor Vance, Amelia sensed with a surge of desperate hope, was not someone who backed down from a fight, especially one that struck so close to her heart. The documents Amelia found also revealed another chilling layer. Tucked into the old land grant file was a faded newspaper clipping from decades ago detailing a bitter zoning dispute. A company called Henderson Development Corp., owned by Karen Henderson's late father, had tried to seize the very same parcel of land for a commercial project. Captain Michael Vance, then a young lawyer fresh out of law school before he joined the Marines, had represented a group of local residents, including several elderly veterans pro bono, and had successfully blocked Henderson Sr.'s development, saving the land for future public use, the very land that would become the Serenity Garden. Karen Henderson's animosity wasn't just about aesthetics or property values. It was a deeply rooted generational vendetta, now tragically violently focused on the memory of the man who had thwarted her family's ambitions years ago. Armed with this pivotal, game-changing, and emotionally charged knowledge, Amelia, her hands trembling slightly, as she dialed the direct, unlisted number for the secretary's office. A number Mrs. Gable had somehow miraculously managed to obtain through old D.C. contacts reached out to Eleanor Vance. Their initial meeting secured with surprising, almost urgent speed, after Amelia briefly respectfully mentioned her brother Michael's plaque and the old Henderson development lawsuit, was held not in a grand, imposing, impersonal government building, but in Eleanor Vance's surprisingly modest, tastefully decorated book-lined office in Washington, D.C. A room that felt more like a scholar's quiet study than a seat of immense federal power. Amelia, nervous, but fiercely determined, Her meticulously organized notes, clutched in her hand, laid out the entire sordid, heartbreaking story. The initial shock and horror of the pre-dawn explosion, Karen Henderson's escalating vindictive campaign of harassment and intimidation, the community's unwavering support and resilience in the face of adversity, the demoralizing, financially draining lawsuit filed by Henderson, and finally, the crucial discovery of the land's federal status. The old zoning battle involving Henderson's father and Michael Vance, and most importantly, Eleanor's profound, deeply personal connection to the desecrated garden. Eleanor Vance listened intently, her usually impassive, thoughtful face, hardening her dark, intelligent eyes, growing colder, flintier, as Amelia recounted the desecration of her brother's memorial and the community's courageous, but increasingly desperate struggle. There were no interruptions, only a focused, absorbing, almost unnerving silence that seemed to draw every detail from Amelia. When Amelia finally finished, her voice hoarse with emotion, her story laid bare. Eleanor Vance's response, though soft-spoken, deliberate, held a core of unyielding tempered steel, a quiet, unmistakable promise of impending, decisive action. "This stops now, Ms. Rodriguez," she said simply, her gaze direct, unwavering, and filled with a cold, righteous anger that mirrored Amelia's own. "This desecration, this disrespect, this calculated act of terror, it ends. And Mrs. Henderson and anyone who aided her will be held fully, unequivocally accountable. My brother and all those honored in that garden deserve nothing less." The climax of the drama unfolded not in a hushed formal courtroom, but at a hastily convened, highly charged emergency town hall meeting in Oak Haven. The air inside the Oak Haven Community Center, usually reserved for bingo nights and local bake sales, was thick with anticipation, unspoken anxieties, a palpable simmering anger, and a desperate, fragile hope. The room was packed to capacity, residents standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls, overflowing into the hallways, their faces a mixture of grim determination, hope, and apprehension. Local news crews, alerted to the potential for a major development, jostled for position at the back. Karen Henderson, flanked by her ever-present smirking, condescending lawyer Arthur Jennings, sat in the front row, reserved for involved parties. She radiated an air of smug, untouchable confidence and barely concealed disdain for the proceedings for the little people of Oak Haven, seemingly oblivious, or more likely utterly indifferent, to the storm of communal fury and grief brewing around her. She adjusted her expensive silk scarf with a flick of her wrist, a picture of unwarranted, almost regal self-assurance. The town mayor, Bill DeCoster, a well-meaning but often overwhelmed and easily intimidated man, spoke first, his voice trembling slightly as he expressed the community's unwavering support for the veterans and their profound collective gratitude for the cherished Serenity Garden. He fumbled with his notes, his gaze darting nervously towards Henderson and Jennings, clearly out of his depth in the face of such raw emotion, such complex legal maneuvering, and such blatant, arrogant villainy. Then Eleanor Vance, invited by Mayor DeCoster at Amelia's quiet but firm suggestion, stepped forward to the podium. A hush fell over the crowded room, a sudden collective intake of breath, as if the air itself was holding its judgment. Her presence, though physically understated in a simple, dark, perfectly tailored suit, commanded an immediate, almost tangible attention. She began to speak, not as a detached, officious government official delivering a prepared statement, but as a grieving sister, her voice quiet, yet resonant, filled with a profound, well-contained sorrow and a righteous, unwavering indignation that cut through the thick tension in the room like a surgeon's scalpel. She recounted with simple, devastating, eloquent poignancy her brother Michael's unwavering dedication to his country, his quiet courage, his infectious laughter, the immense sacrifices he and so many others like him had made, often unseen, unheralded. She spoke of the small, vital solace the veteran's Serenity Garden had provided to those who had served alongside him, to those who mourned them, and to her own family on their infrequent, intensely private visits to Michael's plaque. Her words painted a vivid, deeply moving, intensely personal picture of the garden's true, intrinsic, irreplaceable significance transforming it in the minds of many present from a mere contested patch of public land, a local issue, into a sacred, nationally significant space imbued with memory, sacrifice, and the enduring, unbreakable spirit of service. Then her tone shifted subtly, but unmistakably. The quiet sorrow was overlaid with a steely, formidable resolve. She formally introduced herself, stating her full title slowly, deliberately. "I am Eleanor Vance, Secretary of National Military Memorials for the United States of America." A ripple of surprise, then dawning, stunned understanding went through the audience. She stated unequivocally, and with the full, unassailable weight of federal authority, that the land upon which the Veterans Serenity Garden was situated was, and had always been, since its original deeded grant, under her division's explicit protection jurisdiction and sacred trust. Karen Henderson's lawsuit against the town of Oak Haven, she declared calmly but firmly, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces in the room and landing squarely with laser-like intensity on a now visibly paling, faltering Karen Henderson, was not only entirely baseless, frivolous, and without legal merit, it was a contemptible, despicable affront to the very principles the memorial stood for, an insult to the memory of every man and woman honored there, and an act of profound disrespect to the United States government. Eleanor then dropped her bombshell, her voice ringing with cold, clear, unwavering authority that brooked no dissent. She announced that her office, the National Military Memorials Commission, in conjunction with the Department of Justice, would be filing an immediate comprehensive federal countersuit against Karen Henderson personally and against any associated entities for the willful, malicious destruction of federal property, the desecration of a national military memorial site, conspiracy to commit domestic terrorism, given the clear, premeditated use of explosives and multiple violations of federal statutes protecting veterans and memorial sites. Furthermore, she declared her gaze still fixed on a now ashen-faced, trembling Karen Henderson, whose smug confidence had utterly irrevocably crumbled, that she would be personally overseeing the drafting and immediate introduction of new comprehensive and robust federal legislation to be named the Michael Vance Veterans Memorial Guardian Act, designed to provide significantly enhanced, stringent, and unambiguous protection, including severe criminal penalties to all veterans' memorials, large and small, across the entire nation, ensuring that such a despicable, cowardly act of disrespect and violence could never ever happen again with such impunity. The room erupted, first in a moment of stunned absolute silence as the implications of Eleanor's words sank in. Then, in a collective wave of gasps, astonished murmurs, and finally, in a deafening, sustained, cathartic wave of applause, cheers, shouts of "USA, USA," and tears of profound relief and gratitude, an explosion of emotion that washed over the weary, battered community. Karen Henderson's carefully constructed world of privilege, entitlement, and perceived invincibility had just imploded. Her lawyer, Arthur Jennings, for once in his smarmy career, looked utterly speechless, his mouth slightly agape, his face a mask of horrified disbelief. The hunter had just become the hunted with the full force of the federal government now arrayed against her. Several veterans in the audience, including Gunny Miller, stood slowly, painfully, but with immense dignity, and rendered a sharp, heartfelt salute towards Eleanor Vance. Amelia felt tears streaming down her own face, tears not of sorrow this time, but of overwhelming relief, gratitude, and a fierce, unexpected pride. The falling action began with astonishing, almost breathtaking swiftness, a testament to Eleanor Vance's influence, her determination, and the galvanizing power of national outrage. The federal lawsuit against Karen Henderson moved with the kind of efficiency and speed rarely seen in typical bureaucratic or legal processes, propelled by Eleanor's unwavering personal commitment and the sheer weight of public and political sentiment. The evidence against Karen was overwhelming, meticulously gathered, and irrefutable, the clear enhanced security footage of her purchasing the explosives and detonators. The damning forensic evidence recovered from the blast site, including traces of the specific pyrotechnic compounds and the ADC wrench, linking directly back to those commercial fireworks and her husband's company. The meticulously documented timeline of her escalating harassment and threats against the garden and its veterans. The testimonies of dozens of her neighbors, former employees, and even some disillusioned former associates from Willow Creek Preserve, and the sheer, undeniable, horrifying magnitude of the destruction she had wrought. The burner phone found at the scene, while not directly implicating a VFW member in the bombing itself, revealed a network of informants Henderson had cultivated individuals she had paid for information about park activities and security vulnerabilities, further underscoring her premeditation. Her lawyer, Arthur Jennings, sensing the inevitable crushing defeat and likely fearing for his own reputation, his license and potential complicity charges, now that federal domestic terrorism statutes were involved, quickly, almost desperately, advised Karen Henderson to accept a plea bargain to avoid a lengthy, high-profile public and undoubtedly disastrous trial. The terms of the settlement and plea, negotiated directly by senior DOJ prosecutors under Eleanor Vance's watchful eye, were harsh, unyielding, but undeniably just. Karen Henderson was required to pay full, substantial court-ordered restitution for all damages, including the complete, historically accurate cost of rebuilding and replanting the Veterans Serenity Garden to its former glory and beyond, with an additional endowment for its perpetual care. She faced crippling, multi-million-dollar fines, a lengthy, strictly supervised probation period upon her eventual release, mandatory intensive psychological counseling, and thousands of hours of closely monitored community service, specifically maintaining public parks and cleaning up blighted urban areas, though pointedly and by court order, never again being allowed within 500 yards of any Veterans Memorial or VFW post. Her desperate last-minute attempt to seal the court records, to preserve some shred of her shattered reputation, was summarily contemptuously denied by the presiding federal judge. More significantly, and with far-reaching transformative consequences for the entire nation, Eleanor Vance, true to her word, championed the Michael Vance Veterans Memorial Guardian Act through the often gridlocked halls of Congress. The bill, drafted with remarkable speed, precision, and bipartisan input by her dedicated NMMC team and a coalition of veterans advocacy groups, garnered immediate and widespread, almost unanimous support, fueled by the poignant, widely publicized story of Oak Haven and the simmering national outrage over Karen Henderson's heinous actions. It established severe, unambiguous federal penalties, including significant mandatory minimum prison sentences and hefty, non-negotiable fines for any act of vandalism, damage, desecration, or terrorism against designated veterans' memorials. It streamlined the process for officially designating such memorials for federal protection and provided substantial new federal resources for their upkeep, security enhancements, and educational programs. The small, once obscure community garden in their quiet, unassuming town had become the unlikely, tragic catalyst for a powerful nationwide movement, its violent destruction inadvertently leading to greater security, recognition, respect, and sanctity for countless memorials, large and small, across the entire country. The resolution came not just with legal victories, but with the triumphant, joyous, and profoundly moving rebirth of the Veterans Serenity Garden. With the substantial funds from Karen Henderson's enforced restitution, supplemented by the continued overwhelming outpouring of community donations and the tireless, loving, often tearful efforts of volunteers young and old, the garden was meticulously, painstakingly rebuilt. It rose from the ashes, not just as it was before, but even more vibrant, more resilient, more beautiful, more deeply loved. New mature trees, donated by nurseries from 3 states, were carefully planted to provide shade and solace. Thousands of flowers, including even more fragrant lavender hardy rosemary, and of course, Frank Cole's beloved resilience roses, filled the beds, their colors a defiant explosion against the memory of smoke and ash. More memorial stones were added, each one telling a story of courage, sacrifice, love, and loss. And a beautiful new handcrafted sign this time, forged from enduring polished granite, a gift from a national monument company, proudly marked its entrance, Oak Haven Veterans Serenity Garden, reclaimed, remembered, resilient. The reopening ceremony, held on a glorious sun-drenched spring morning, exactly 1 year after the bombing, was a profoundly moving and joyous occasion, a powerful testament to the community's unbreakable unity, their unwavering respect for their veterans, and the ultimate triumph of hope, love, and remembrance over hatred, violence, and despair. The entire town, it seemed, turned out, lining the streets, waving small American flags. Veterans from neighboring communities from across the state, even from other parts of the country, came to show their solidarity, their presence, a powerful statement of shared purpose. Eleanor Vance returned for the ceremony, not as the imposing secretary from Washington, but simply as Eleanor, a neighbor, a fellow mourner, a sister. Her presence, though still quiet, was a deeply personal affirmation of their shared loss and their collective, hard-won, and deeply meaningful triumph. As she stood among the Oakhaven veterans, her hand resting gently reverently on the newly unveiled gleaming brass plaque honoring her brother Michael, a plaque now twice the size of the original, its lettering deeper, more permanent, Amelia saw a faint, genuine, beautiful smile touch her lips, a smile that reached her usually serious, thoughtful eyes, a smile that spoke of peace, of closure, of a battle well fought and won. Karen Henderson, ostracized by the community she had tried to dominate and terrorize, facing financial ruin from the lawsuits, fines and restitution, and burdened with the undeniable public shame of her heinous actions, eventually sold her sterile modern house at a significant loss. No one in Oakhaven wanted to buy it and moved away, disappearing into ignominy, a pariah in a town that had learned through fire, terror, and fury the true, enduring, and unbreakable meaning of community respect and remembrance. Her meticulously manicured, unnaturally perfect lawn, once a symbol of her obsessive control and her disdain for the natural world, gradually became overgrown weeds, choking her prized ornamental grasses, a silent, fitting testament to her absence and her ultimate abject failure. The veterans' Serenity Garden, however, flourished as never before. It became an even more vital, cherished heart of Oakhaven, a permanent living beacon of respect, a vibrant, fragrant, and deeply moving testament to the enduring power of memory, the unexpected, profound strength found in unity, and the quiet, unwavering courage of those who stand up against intolerance, hatred, and violence in all its forms. The shocking, brutal blast had undeniably shaken their world to its core, threatening to tear apart the very fabric of their peaceful, close-knit existence. But from the dust, the rubble, the pain, and the tears had bloomed something stronger, more beautiful, more resilient, and infinitely more meaningful. A legacy of courage, community, and remembrance that would endure for generations to come, a lesson etched not just in stone and bronze, but in the hearts of all who had witnessed its destruction and its rebirth. The scent of lavender and rosemary, once a symbol of what was lost, now filled the air again, sweeter, richer, and more poignant than ever before, a fragrant promise of healing hope and enduring peace. Gunny Miller, his hands once again deep in the soil, often brought local school children to the garden, teaching them not just about plants, but about courage, sacrifice, and the importance of remembering. He'd smile a genuine, warm smile this time as he helped a small child pat down the earth around a newly planted rose bush. "This one's for all of them," he'd say, his voice soft. "They're all still here, so you just gotta look."